Welcome back to General Ecology. In this segment, I'll be talking about succession. And again, this is my wheelhouse. I've been thinking about succession since probably before many of you were born, I'm guessing, 89, 90 or so. What I discovered in graduate school when I took a class in plant community ecology is that all these guys were talking who had been doing graduate work for a while and reading and checking out the literature and all that. And they were talking about things about community ecology and succession and things like that. And I was this new kid, and it all made sense. I've been thinking about all the stuff they were talking about as I was backpacking this year in Nevada and such. It all made sense. Or same deal, tide pooling, right? In Santa Barbara and Southern California, going out onto, I love to tide pool, look at those, all the different things that were adhering to the rocks and figure out what was going on in a pool and why they could survive if the water level dropped down, things like that. So anyway, this is both good and bad for you. It's good because you're getting a pretty well-versed set of information here. I know a lot about this topic, but that's also bad. I know a lot about this topic, so you're going to hear probably more than you would normally. Before we go there, that first slide that we just had up, I just wanted to show you, remember the last time I was ranting and raving that their image in the book of kelp on the right, a kelp forest, but really not much taller than a lobster. Also, lobsters are on the East Coast, and kelp grows in, again, Southern California. So if we go to the other slide, this also came out of the book from an earlier chapter 1 actually, where they're talking about the dynamics of the kelp forest and how there's this massive food web that goes on in the kelp forest. These kelp forests provide nursing settings, so that's this picture over here on the left side, and a human would be about that tall. These things are 20, 30 meters, well, feet, meters, they're tall. Great place to go scuba diving. There's sea urchins down at the bottom. I just want you to know that those kelp forests are truly forests. They're kind of like redwoods. So just to kind of put it in perspective. Anyway, let's move on. We are here today to talk about succession, not about kelp. These are images of Mount St. Helens, which is one of the volcanoes in the Cascade Range. Others you've heard of are Mount Rainier, Mount Shasta, Mount Lassen, those last two in California, Mount St. Helens, Mount Baker, others going up through Oregon all the way up through Washington. And they're part of a subduction zone out on the coast, out in the Pacific Ocean, and it's bringing material down below the crust of the continental shelf or continental crust, and then that comes up periodically as these volcanoes, and it's the Ring of Fire, right? So this is Mount St. Helens prior to 1980, or let's pretend it is 1980. I knew people that would, cross-country ski. This picture from Chuck Ton. They'd hike up and then ski back down. Pretty well-known recreation zone in Oregon. Actually, it's just over into Washington. Then, one day, there was this massive volcano eruption, I should say. And I remember it very well. I was in 12th grade, 1980, I think. It might have been 11th. But I was in 12th grade. And that volcano blew its top. It was very impressive. And you can imagine what happened. I mean, there were a lot of studies that got initiated on the succession of that event. What happened to all these trees? And so we're going to go ahead and look at some of this in today's session. Remember that when things happen like wildfire, this is a picture of I've already shown you these, I'll say it again here, but this was one of my plots for my PhD. It's a mixed stand of Douglas fir with the thicker leaves or canopy here, and then the thin, skinny ones. No, actually, the thicker ones are pine, and then the thin ones are Douglas fir. It was a mixed stand. A couple years later, there are all the seedlings. So all the seed drop over here on the right, and then they germinated, and there's a whole storyline that I'm not going to get into, but there they are getting established. Here's Martin Bittertondo, who joined the lab after, well, he joined just before I left, after I got my PhD. And then here's our PhD advisor a couple years later, and you can see that succession happens. The National Park Service wanted to know from us if they were going to have, if they needed to do something like plant trees in that site. And so my advisor and I, Tom Bruns and I, went out there. The fire was still out of control nearby, and we saw all those seed out there. And we said, boy, if you broadcast spray ryegrass to prevent erosion, first of all, in the next rainy season, you're going to convert the system from a forested system to a meadow, okay? And not a good idea. And that's going to have other negative effects down the road in subsequent years. So they didn't, fortunately. And as you can see in that one picture, it became a bishop pine stand, which is what it was before, although Douglas fir had gotten in after 35 years into some of those areas. So yeah, there's Dr. Bruns. You can also see he was probably not looking at the pines. He was looking at the fungi that were growing on this charcoal bark over here because, well, he's a mycologist first and foremost. It's hard to get him to look at anything else. Okay, so succession happens. Succession is a process in which species replace each other over time. Now that says replace each other, or yeah, it should say each other. But the idea here, I want you to know that it's not like they are actually interacting to be in a successional sequence. It's happening. Okay, so they're not replacing each other. They are replacing other species. So maybe that shouldn't say each other. Succession does not always produce a single climax. That is the end point. There could be a variety, A, B, C, D, F, whatever, depending often a lot on the initial conditions, which we'll talk about in a little bit later, the earliest stages of succession. And then there are all sorts of pathways along the way with different mechanisms, and so that's why the endpoint changes, okay, or will be different. Very rarely does a researcher have the opportunity to walk and see it all through at one location, right? So you have to kind of go look at a lot of different places where that same plant community is generally in that location, and then try to put all the pieces together and say, you know, this is where this is going. This one's at a mid stage, this one's at an early stage, this one's at a late stage, and you can kind of put all the parts together and come up with what the succession is on that site or in that area. All right, so where does this concept come from? It's not that old, although a lot of you are probably thinking 1911, gosh, that's like we keep hearing about the early 1900s flu epidemic. That's ancient. This is not our world. True enough, but in science, that's actually a fairly recent bit of information that we can look back on and say, this is where it started. A guy named Henry Cowles, that's him over there on the right. He was working in the Indiana Dunes, which is at in the Great Lakes region, and you can see that image there shows you 4 different images with sort of dune succession in progress. The upper left is earliest stage, right in here. So things are just starting to get established, some grasses, and when they get established, their roots are going down into the sand and preventing them from shifting. So pretty soon, the sand dune system starts to stabilize after the earliest plants get established. The grasses stabilize that sand. That leads the conditions, or lends the conditions for other plants, herbs, and small shrubs to get established now because the sand doesn't cover over them with each wind, and pretty soon you wind up with trees, okay? And so the first successional study, 1911, this predates our friends that we're going to see in a minute, but it predates Clements. Remember we talked about Clements last time with Gleasonian and Clementian sort of ideas about communities. This is before Clements. They're probably contemporaries, but the papers that were coming out were a little bit earlier in Cowles' case. And he really documented this idea about primary succession. Now that's going to be different. We're going to talk a little bit later on secondary succession. Let me just say that one way to think about what primary succession is, if it's a situation where the soils and the system is sort of devoid of biotic parts. There's no microbes in the soil, no fungi, no bacteria, no microarthropods, certainly no plants, no animals. It's new. The best way to think of that would be in a Hawaiian island situation where a new lava flow has come out. It's rock, right? There is no biotic activity there. Over time, it comes in, maybe lichens first. The lichens start to create something like a dirt or soil, etc. And then eventually it builds up to what you might think of as a Hawaiian island habitat. So that's primary succession, starting from scratch, no biotic activity. Think of it that way. All right, and in these sand dunes, that's how it starts. I'm sure if you took a little probe and did some PCR analysis, you'd find there were bacteria in there. But for the most part, this is fairly novel land for colonizing. Whether it's a plant or bacterium, it's new. And so Cowles says, okay, sand dune succession around Lake Michigan, you start with bare ground, or in this case sand, moves into grasses and herbs. Eventually you get shrubs getting established and trees, right? And this is a chronosequence. So this takes maybe 100 years to get to the tree phase, the late stage. And there are very few people who have the time to record all of that information on a specific site. So what Henry Cowles did and what others do is, as I said, go to different locations and find places that are at different stages and put the whole picture together, all right? And you have to look at a sequence of communities over time and space versus a chronosequence, a sequence of communities in the same place. But hard to have the time to look at that and record it in the human lifetime. So there he is again. I kind of blew him up, if you will. He kind of looks like a grump. This picture was in the old conference room in Illick Hall, and I knew enough about Cowles because my research was on primary succession and secondary succession, but it was on primary succession during my postdoc. I had read a lot about him, and I found these pictures, and I saw him up there, and I was like, oh my God, this guy was kind of sour. And yet he was out there hiking around the woods all the time. Well, I finally did find a better picture of him, and there he is in a much better mood. I don't know what happened there in that illustration, but he looks like someone I could go hiking with and talk about succession. So anyway, just thought I'd throw that out there. Okay, now we jump to this guy you've already heard about. Clements is big in ecology, and he's very big in succession. He basically, other than Cowles, who sort of set the stage, he comes along and gave us all kinds of important ideas that we still hold as important today. 100 years later, that's pretty impressive. So let's look at what he said. Said that each species paves the way for the next. So he's getting his ideas probably in part from Cowles. The ultimate association of a species at a location is called the climax community. And the third idea is that succession is linear. All right? We're going to come back to that idea of succession being linear in a little bit. But so he says that each species paves the way for the next. It could just be dropping litter on the ground and creating a better environment like moisture that gets stuck in that litter for the next species. It could be nitrogen-fixing bacteria coming in with alder to provide a more nutritious, so to speak, soil for the next species that need more nitrogen. You can think of other examples, I'm sure. The end point, so to speak, is that climax community, and again, succession is a linear process going A, B, C, D, E, F on down to the climax. So if we think of it, the easiest way to think of it is it's an arrow going from early to late stage, from nothing to a very complex, potentially, plant community. I had the good fortune to go to a conference in Australia and went out to the Great Barrier Reef, and we did some snorkeling, and then we went up onto this, actually some scuba diving as well, onto this beach made of coral, right? It's just big piles of coral and shells, and plants get established there. So I took this picture, I just kind of went walking off by myself and found these interesting sort of mangrovey, which is not so much a plant, but a plant type that can live in these conditions. And I said, aha, there's my primary succession. I crawled under those shrubs over there on the left, and I found a coconut getting established. So that coconut had floated around and made its way onto this island. Now it's establishing, the roots are going down, the shoots are going up, and eventually you're going to have this nice little coconut island there. I suspect by now it is a coconut island because this was 20 years ago. All right, so that's primary succession. The coral, yes, is life, but it's really, the terrestrial part of this is really starting from scratch. And here's the example they have in the book. Islands are a great place for understanding primary succession, but so are volcanoes, and the best situation is a volcanic island. So if you look on this picture of Krakatau here, you can see this is all sort of brand new lava. There was some here as well, but this has had some successional time, if you will. There was a new flow right through it, but this stuff out here has been there long enough for the plants to get established. And if this was a Horton presentation, he would tell you he needs to get his laser pointer. There it is. Okay, so erupted in 1883. You could look up the history of the Krakatau eruption. It made a very dramatic impact globally. It was a huge eruption, and you could see what was once a big island became nothing with a new little sort of vent creating what we call Krakatau today. So that was a massive explosion. It created maybe a little mini ice age with so much dust and particles in the atmosphere that it got cooler because of that. But the more important thing for our purposes is that we have a very nice primary successional sequence. People have been studying it. I met a guy who is actually part of his job from Britain, is looking at continuing the research that started in 1883 at how this successional sequence has been occurring on this portion of Krakatau. And you can read about this in the book. But one of the things we've learned from that particular situation is that different dispersal mechanisms yield different timing as to what gets to the island and gets established. It's really a function of dispersal limitations. You'll hear that again. So by 1886, 10 of the first 26 species were sea dispersed. Sea, not seed, but sea. They came in on the water, like that coconut. All right. Then you pick up things that are wind dispersed. It's out in the middle of the ocean, so there's a long way to go. And then eventually animal dispersed. Okay, forests develop. And so if we look at this, the dispersal to Krakatau after the eruption starts with things that came over the ocean, including, by the way, big rafts of just flotsam and jetsam, not plastics that we talk about today, but pieces of wood floating around. There are redwood chunks in the bottom of, or that have sunk, made their way to Hawaii, that came over from Northern California. So we know that things float around the ocean quite a bit. And with those rafts come sea dispersed insects, plants, and things. Second to arrive are the wind dispersed, and they're going to be probably fewer because wind is whipping it all over the place, but it's highly diffuse. Whereas on a raft, it's all coming together, and if it gets there, it's a big chunk of sort of a community in and of itself. And then the last to arrive are the animal dispersed, so things that are on maybe birds that are flying out there. Maybe somehow something could be animal dispersed through the water, like a fish, somehow carrying something to the island that would get established. I don't know. Okay, now here is our Mount St. Helens example after the eruption. The first thing is, if you go out, I've had the good fortune to be able to go to this site twice. Once in 1984, so it blew up in 80, and they had just opened it up to allow hikers to go in. We were not allowed to have matches or fuel or anything because it was just a big, dry, dead, basically tinderbox. And so we had to, all of our food had to be cold. We ate a lot of granola on that trip. We actually camped pretty close to where this picture is taken, looking down to Spirit Lake. Yeah, this one here. And what you can see is the spruce are just getting established again here. The conifers, I believe they're spruce. But the other areas, there are herbs over here, this pearly everlasting that does really well right after a fire, doesn't need any mycorrhizal or any other kind of symbiotic associations. The seeds float through the wind very easily, and they become established very soon. Nothing else is really out there, except probably the one down here, which is called fireweed. You see that all over Alaska and anywhere where there's been a fire. Again, wind-dispersed seed, very lightly, floating through the wind or with the wind, and then they get established. So what happens in these kinds of successional sequences, first you get resprouts. And so before we go there, let me just say also that at the edge of the blast zone, out in here, in this upper left image, not all the trees died, okay? A lot of these were heat killed, so they died within a year, but out here they're alive. And so there's your dispersal of new conifer seeds into the blast zone. They don't make it all the way to where the crater is because it's just too far to go. But this area is looking like this, and even more so, full of conifers today, because there was plenty of seeds being produced over the years, and they're being dispersed into that site. As you get closer to the crater, it starts to look like a moonscape. And you can sense it down in here too. It looks like a moonscape pretty far away. It was devastating, devastating. Okay, so first you get resprouts, things that didn't quite get killed, but could resprout. And on the edge of the blast zone also, you didn't get this thick ash layer that you got right next to the crater. So I'll come back to that, I think, in a little bit. Then you have movement of soil with seeds, and one of the cool things is that at the crater, so I'll go there now, it was like 100 feet deep of ash. And they started seeing after a couple of years that there were little islands of plants that were getting established in the middle of that area. Hundreds of feet down is where the biotic activity somehow survived, and it was making its way up 100 feet through the ash after it cooled, and somehow getting established in these little pockets. And what they discovered is that things like gophers and other burrowing animals, mammals, were digging their way up, and with them came seeds and soils that then got established up on top. So not all of them survived or had the ability to get up there, but a few did, and you start seeing these little islands of vegetation out in the middle of nowhere, where it was, again, this kind of moonscape way out in the middle of, or actually right in the middle of the blast zone. So those soils are being moved, and with it seeds and spores for mycorrhizal associations. So then after the movement with the animals, you got dispersal by wind and animals, and then plants that did not need symbionts got established first, like our pearly everlasting and our fireweed, the pink fireweed, the white pearly everlasting. And then plants that did need symbionts established second, things that needed nitrogen-fixing bacteria, such as the legumes, and those that needed mycorrhizal fungi, such as conifers and pretty much every other plant except for pearly everlasting and the fireweed. So all of that plays into how the community, the initial regeneration of the community gets started. Okay. Here's the site. It's on the east side of the Cascade Range, and it's a big basaltic lava flow from an eruption that happened before Europeans, and I think there are legend or mythological records of this eruption with the local peoples. But it's a very vague reference to the fact that there was a massive blast, actually I think associated with Crater Lake. But it's not pre-human history, it is pre-European history. Regardless, what you're seeing in this image are hemlock out in the middle of that area. I was very intrigued with, at the time, trying to figure out how do plants get established out in the middle of nowhere. And I was thinking of doing my postdoc work out here, and then, since I'm a mycorrhizal guy, I thought, how am I going to get the roots out of there? I'd have to use dynamite or something. I wound up in a sandy ecosystem instead. But look at those hemlock. They get established, and boy, that's starting over from scratch. But because the soil is so scant, it's big black basaltic rock, it is taking hundreds and hundreds of years for that successional sequence to move along. It will continue to take hundreds and hundreds of years. That rock is not degrading very fast. Okay, here's another classic succession story, probably as classic as the Krakatoa. And this is in Glacier Bay, and it's now a national park, and it's up in Alaska, down in the southeast portion. And John Muir visited. I had the chance to visit recently, or not too recently actually, right after I did my PhD, and was able to kayak in and around this area. We'll see in a minute, maybe this area. And it's retreating, right? In 1794, the glacier was down here. This is the Pacific Ocean. And then by 1840, it has retreated back to here. By 1879, back to here. 1994, back to here. So this glacier has been on the retreat for quite some time. And we were able to kayak in and get right up to where the wall of the glacier was. I don't remember which of these. I think we were over in this region. I don't recall. But point is that we were right up there at the wall, and you could see the glaciers calving off into the ocean or into the bay. It's still a very active site. If you get a chance to, it's worth going up there. So here is the image again. If you blow up, which one? I think, yeah, this is here. So we're blowing this portion up, and now I'm going to blow it up a little further so that you could see. I'm going to show you a little, storyline here. So we were kayaking. We had kayaked. We started here, got dropped off by the national park, kayaked over here, saw orcas very close to the boats. They didn't care who we were. We were very curious as to who they were and whether they thought we were food. They did not. They left us alone. Saw a lot of humpbacks. We went over into this region, got up into here, and then we came back to here, and I don't know if you can see that little strip of land right in there, but we could take the high tide across and then camp out on this beach, which we did. We wanted to go down through here because we heard there were timber wolves could be heard, if not seen, and that sounded good, and then get picked up down here by the national park again. Turns out there was a 1-year-old grizzly bear who came and told us this was his territory. In fact, he had just been kicked out by his mom, and he was hungry. The end of spring, we were starting to see tidal flats. This is where his food base was, and we were camped out there. And he decided to tell us to leave. We had 3 boats, broke 2 of them, and my friend and I were able to take the 3rd one over to get help. Nobody was hurt, property was damaged. The bear was allowed to stay there, but there were no more, they weren't allowing people to go into that area anymore after that because unfortunately the bear got into some of our food. So anyway, intertidal zone is rich with life, lots of succession going on in there, but I had to tell you this story about this bear, the bad bear. Grizzlies. I've seen a lot of black bear in my backpacking trips in the Sierras, up in the Cascades, even out here. I'm not threatened by them. Maybe I should be more threatened. But the grizzlies, that's a whole nother story. And that dude was not happy with us. So it broke 2 of our tents also, threw our food in our kitchen all over the place. It's pretty bad. Anyway, that's it for the beginning here with primary succession. In the next segment, we're going to move to secondary succession. So we'll see you next time. Thanks.